JR Strain presents Flight Sim Carrier Landings for World War II prop aircraft. Hello folks, JR Strain here, and I want to talk about carrier landings, specifically flight simulator carrier landings, and even more specifically, why it makes sense for us to do carrier landings in very much the same way as the real guys did it in World War II. Now, this video will discuss landing operations for propeller aircraft on straight deck carriers, which is a very different procedure than landing a jet aircraft on an angled deck carrier. So, if you come from years of practice in a jet sim, you will need to adjust your approach and retrain a few bad habits, like that burning urge to jam the throttle forward as you touch down on the flat top, which is a big no-no for World War II carrier ops. Now, what you commonly see in carrier landings from sim pilots is, well, nothing common. For many different reasons, there are as many techniques as there are pilots. Which is all well and good when you're flying in single-player mode, but when you are flying in an online multiplayer setting and want to get everyone down on deck quickly and efficiently, there needs to be structure and common procedure in the operation. And for that, we need look no further than the men who mastered efficient carrier operations in World War II, the United States Navy. For those of you who want a comprehensive look at World War II carrier operations, not just flight deck, but throughout the entire carrier, or for any just casual World War II enthusiast, I can't recommend more highly the video The Fighting Lady, which is about an hour in length and can be found on the YouTube at the URL listed on the screen. But for those of you who just want to learn the proper procedure for getting down on deck, let's take a look at how the U.S. Navy conducted carrier landings during World War II. Now, the objective of aircraft recovery is to impose order on a situation potentially consumed by complete chaos. And chaos is what the Navy faced nearly every time the air units returned from their combat missions, as the air over the carrier would quickly fill with several dozens of aircraft of different types, some badly damaged, some with pilots or crew members wounded, often low on fuel, sometimes arriving in pieces from different altitudes and directions, rather than as the organized strike force they comprised when they departed on their mission. The Navy's solution to this initial chaos was known as the Hawk Circle. The Hawk Circle was a circle 2,000 to 3,000 feet above the carrier where returning aircraft would enter a counterclockwise left-hand banking turn over their designated carrier. Priority aircraft, that is, those that were damaged or low on fuel or had wounded aircrew, would enter the Hawk Circle and descend to the 2,000-foot level, while healthy aircraft with adequate fuel would circle above at 3,000 feet. Aircraft would form up in groups of 3s and 4s for landing. The first group of 4 priority aircraft to land would reduce throttle and descend from the Hawk Circle in echelon starboard formation to make what is known as the initial pass by the carrier. This is an overhead look at the pattern with the Hawk Circle. The departure zone from the Hawk Circle, where aircraft would begin descent, starts at the midpoint of what would be crosswind for a normal air traffic pattern, seen clearly here as the top of the pattern and extended along the direction of the Hawk Circle to a point about equal to the fantail of the carrier. The initial pass would be made by the carrier island at 300 to 400 feet of altitude and around 150 knots IAS, or indicated airspeed, and the pilots would extend their tailhooks before passing the fantail of the carrier so the assistant landing signal officer could confirm all 4 aircraft to land had their hooks properly deployed. As the flight extended their initial pass beyond the bow of the carrier, airspeed would be reduced to 120 knots IAS, and when the lead aircraft reached a position 2, maybe 3 carrier lengths beyond the bow, he began a shallow banking left turn onto the crosswind and ultimately the downwind leg, 1,000 to 1,200 yards abeam the carrier's path. The second pilot in the group would begin counting off 30 seconds after the lead pilot's turn and then make his turn onto crosswind. This would create a 30-second gap all the way around the pattern. Likewise, the third pilot in the group would count 30 seconds after the second pilot's turn and make his own turn, and the fourth pilot would follow suit, creating a full 90-second spread between the landing of the first aircraft and the landing of the fourth aircraft in the flight. This 30-second gap would be maintained throughout the recovery process as each lead pilot for each group in the Hawk Circle that was in or approaching the departure zone out of the Hawk Circle would count off 30 seconds from the prior group's descent out of the circle before leading his own group down. This allowed a carrier to recover her entire strike group, which could be as many as 65 planes including fighter escorts, in just a little over half an hour, assuming all went well. In simulators, though, we don't need to worry about deck crew unhooking the cable, stowing the tailhook, lowering the crash barrier, pushing the aircraft forward of the barrier for engine shutdown on the bow, and then deck respotting. We just need to taxi forward to clear the deck for other pilots. So 15-second intervals should be more than adequate for recovery ops, which simply means every pilot counts off 15 seconds from the previous pilot's turn in the pattern, rather than the 30 seconds that the Navy actually used. So quickly back to our pattern before we actually show the landing process. And the lead pilot was just about to enter the downwind leg 1,000 to 1,200 yards abeam the carrier's path. As the pilot approaches the downwind leg, landing gear and flaps are deployed. Now this is a tricky part of the pattern where timing can get screwed up because the aircraft will slow down considerably when landing flaps are extended, and some aircraft like the TBF Avenger and War Thunder have a big tendency to nose up and climb dramatically when landing flaps are deployed. So know your aircraft and be prepared to throttle up and press the stick forward to maintain 120 knots IAS and begin a slight descent from 300 feet as you enter downwind to reach 150-200 feet of altitude when you begin your turn onto the base leg for final approach to the carrier. The turn onto base is initiated when you cross the line equal to the carrier's fantail, and this is where the accomplished carrier pilot earns his stripes. As Navy pilots turned onto base leg, the assistant LSO would visually confirm that gear and flaps were down on the approaching aircraft and confirm Prep Charlie to the LSO. That was a signal to the LSO to begin guiding the pilot in for landing. The point of a banking left turn into the carrier deck was so that the pilot could clearly see both the landing area of the deck and the LSO from his cockpit and over the left side of the cowling. Upon reaching the midpoint of the base leg, the aircraft would be holding 7 to 10 knots above stall speed and about 90 feet of altitude. In simulators, because depth perception is a bit off due to the flat screen and we have no LSO to guide us in, a higher altitude is perfectly okay. 120 to 130 feet usually works best. So this is how it should look. Keep turning steadily into the carrier. I found a really good technique is just to keep the port corner of the fantail as a visual target, because by the time you get there, the carrier will have moved and you'll be perfectly situated in the groove when it is time to level out the plane for cut and land. Knowing when you are well grooved for landing and when you are too fast or too slow or too low or too high is simply a matter of practicing in each aircraft. Some aircraft, like the SBD Dauntless, are very forgiving for even late adjustments in the groove that will still allow you to cut and land, while others like the Avenger and especially the Corsair can be very unforgiving and require very consistent techniques on approach to the groove. So what's the groove? Well, the groove is the last part of the turn into the landing path just aft of the fantail, where the pilot would level out his wings and look for the LSO for the cut or the wave off signal. Cut meant cut throttle to 0, and because the aircraft still had a second or two to go to reach the deck, the reduced power, coupled with gradual back pressure by the pilot on the stick to flare the nose, would quickly pull the aircraft down to stall speed, and the plane would plunge to the deck in a controlled crash. A wave off meant gunning the throttle and climbing gently to the left inside of the landing pattern so as not to disrupt landing operations. As a sim pilot, you will just simply have to learn when to wave yourself off from a bad approach, and when it happens, you can either tag onto a group descending from the Hawk Circle to make an initial pass, or you will need to climb back up to the circle and prepare for another descent to the pattern. Now let's take a look at the landing in cockpit view. This is slowed down to about 80% of normal speed. The approach in this case was higher than normal because the landing pattern was disrupted for me on downwind, so I entered my base leg at nearly 500 feet, and that meant I reduced throttle more than I normally would to bleed altitude on the base turn into the groove. And this also meant I had a little more airspeed than I would normally prefer, about 15 knots above stall speed here on my approach to the groove. So you can see I'm managing the turn just fine, and I make one last bank into the groove, cut my throttle, and flare the nose gently up to bleed speed, which allows me to stall just above the deck at about the 5th wire, which I catch longer than I would prefer, but hey, any landing you can walk away from, right? So I didn't want to bore you with a demonstration of taxiing operations. Basically, after successful landing, just taxi forward on the center line until passing the carrier island, and then turn right to taxi up the starboard side to the bow of the carrier. And as more pilots recover, the lead pilot can then taxi across the bow to the port side and then back towards the stern to prepare for taxiing to takeoff positions once everyone is down and recovered. Although, of course, this is complicated in War Thunder by the fact that the game respawns everyone near the fantail after rearming, refueling, and repairing if all players don't continue to taxi. So keep that in mind. Anyway, that's our look at World War II landing procedures and proper landing procedure in flight simulators. I hope this video was helpful for you, and you and your buddies can start nailing those carrier traps together quickly, efficiently, on a regular basis. Thanks a lot for watching.